So Frontier asked me to make something for E3 this year. More specifically, they asked me to make the Los Angeles Convention Center in which it is held in Planet Coaster, which you're looking at right now. Now you can see it pass by in the E3 trailer for Planet Coaster, and you can also find a much better video that puts the park in a much better light, probably on the Planet Coaster channel on YouTube. But just if you're wondering how it was made and could go for some extra Planet Coaster videos, I guess. I did record some of the making of this park and figured I would just throw that together to make this quick video on, well, how the park was made, pretty much. Though just a quick disclaimer, I didn't actually film making the exterior of the building, because that turned into a terrible process of trial and error and actually became really time consuming, much more so than the indoor parts of this park actually, and wasn't really that fit for a time-lapse, especially since I just wanted to do one video on this. So yeah, that's just something to keep in mind here. But starting off, I basically already built the building here and had the sort of basic shape of it in mind already. I, just for time constraints, was going with the South Exhibit Hall. Basically, the Los Angeles Convention Center is mainly divided into two parts. There's the South and the West Convention Hall. And just to make things a bit easier here, I figured I would go with the South one, since it is the biggest one, and the one that has by far the most recognizable entrance, especially with that big glass facade at the front of it, and just seemed best fit for a indoor theme park in here. I also wanted to lay it out similarly to the real convention hall. Like, obviously there are a couple of things to note about this building, since it's not completely true to the nature of the real convention hall. Part of the reason, of course, being that there is a theme park inside of it. But I also changed the scale of the building. It's on a scale of 1 to 1.2 which seems very awfully specific. But one of the issues that I sort of came across was that the increments of the front facade in real life are 9 degrees, while they're 15 degrees is like the lowest increment that you can have in Planet Coaster and still have it be reliable. Which is why 9 squares in Planet Coaster would effectively be 15 squares in real life, so it is quite a bit smaller than the real-time counterpart. I also went with that idea since halfway building an earlier version it turned out to be way too big for the map to actually fit on, and in hindsight this much smaller scale works out a bit better for making a small theme park, because I want to make a sort of family-oriented theme park as well. I originally took a lot of inspiration from Lotte World in Korea, which you might want to look up if you're into indoor theme parks or theme parks in general. It's pretty famous. It's the biggest indoor theme park in the world, still is, I believe, but it's arguably also the most beautiful one. It's a really beautiful indoor park, so it's sort of my first idea that I wanted to go to when I wanted to make something indoor. But at later stages I actually figured, especially considering the size of this thing and the flat rides that we have at the moment, as well as just in general the scenery pieces that we have at the moment, I figured it would be best to go with something like the park Toverland in the Netherlands. You might know it if you're Dutch especially. It's a pretty underrated park in the Netherlands, which started off as an indoor theme park. Now it's much more, and it's been investing crazily, but it has some really like small children and family oriented indoor halls, and it's got just the right amount of like being quite small and just a modest theme park, while at the other hand just having some nice rides and scenery that I figured it would be a good inspiration for this kind of park. And so that's the sort of idea that I went with, and in that sort of spirit, much like the first hall in Toverland, I wanted to have like one sort of main attraction in the hall that you could see like in the entire hall, which in Toverland is a small Vekoma Junior coaster, and in this case I figured I would make it a small Zero Junior coaster for lack of Vekomas, and that's basically what I went with. So that's mainly going to be the centerpiece of the park, not just in the fact that the ride more or less goes everywhere, it's also going to have like a pretty big station that more or less sets the theme for the rest of the park and fills in a sort of central role that otherwise a Disney castle would have. And there are a couple of practical reasons for this theme as well. It's honestly, Alpine is a theme that I've done way too many times before and kind of should probably avoid at this time, but it's also something I can do pretty quickly, and truth be told, this was made in a pretty short time span, especially considering that this was a very unfortunate period, because it was right after my exams had ended and I finally opened up some free time, but just before it had to be sent over to E3, which was kind of awkward, and it just felt like the most safe choice to go for an Alpine, because I can pretty much wing that at this point, even though it's pretty uninspired. Though I'm still really happy with how this station came out, especially considering that it's more or less the central focus of the park in general. And it also really works from the standpoint that this is a pretty low hall, considering the fact that I did want to make the building of the convention center true to scale. Since I made the building in here quite a bit smaller than the real-life counterpart, but I still wanted to get the dimensions more or less right, the roof, or the ceiling I should say in this case, is pretty low, so I couldn't really build anything really high, so that meant no high flat rides, no very tall roller coasters, but also no big towers on my buildings, and really the only theme that I figured would be quite reliable for a somewhat small building, but still the building that would be the largest within the theme park and have this sort of central focus, would be something that has an Alpine theme. It's also kind of generic without being too generic, like it's still a theme, but it's something that isn't too unique or stands out too much to be the entire theme of a theme park, I feel. So yeah, that was pretty much my idea for it. And in terms of the style, it is quite different from the sort of Grizzly Valley Alpine that I've tried before, which was pretty much my first messing around in Planet Coaster, so definitely should show an improvement over that. Like using some of the bricks over here to make the roofs, which looks just a little bit better. One of the biggest things about this station, I think, which I'm quite happy with, is how sort of playful the roof is. I did want to keep it to just the very simple gable roofs here, just because they're sort of, well, Alpine staple at this point, and just because I didn't want to go overboard with towers or details everywhere, and just to make the entire station design a bit more playful and dynamic, I wanted to stack a few different roofs in like different settings, different heights, and at different parts of the station, just to make it look a bit more interesting from the different angles from which you can look at it, while still making it pretty simple of a building. And I was actually really happy with how the cornerstones turn out on the side of that tower there. Definitely something I want to remember for future reference as well. It's a little bit light, I guess, compared to the texture of the wall itself, but cornerstones like that have more or less always been a favorite Alpine thing for me, especially since Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 had them with Alpines, with the Alpine sets of Shy Guy, and just something I wanted to get in here as well. And just to make it still a bit fancy and have a nice little tower right in front of the entrance, so you at least have like a tall structure in front of the entrance, as tall as I could get it in this hall at least. I wanted to get a small spire, which almost touches the ceiling, as you might be able to tell actually by the blue lines, which I haven't actually talked about. The blue lines in the sky at the moment are basically my markers for how high the ceiling is going to be, which is why I wanted to have them there. Though I am still going to add like some girders underneath the ceiling to be able to realistically support it, so it's not an entirely realistic representation of how high the ceiling is going to be, but it's more or less a good clue to how high I could make these buildings, and like what sort of flat rides could be that I could use in this park in general. And a couple other touches to this building is, the rest is pretty simple, really, just windows and doors. A little bit of wooden framework, but I didn't want to go overboard with the framework in here. It's a pretty important staple of Alpine buildings in general too, but I was pretty happy with how the very simplistic wooden framework looked here, but I definitely did want to have some flower boxes, which at the moment you can definitely build flower boxes out of better things than what I've done here, especially the wooden bracket actually works pretty well for it, but it's just something that I really felt the need to get into this building, since it's just one of those things that is just so very Alpine and it just breathes atmosphere, especially since this park is going to be somewhat simple and not going to be anything really epic or massive or incredibly detailed in that way. I wanted to create like a nice little atmosphere without having to go into like ridiculous budget, and one of the nice ways to always be able to do that is to just add some planters and some window boxes around the buildings. Now I wanted to add this big path around this center part of the roller coaster, and the plan is more or less to, within that path, avoid any kind of flat ride or anything like that, and keep it just to services and the coaster itself, and have the flat rides and all that good stuff on the outer rings, or more or less outside of this main sort of path. Just have this be, you know, sort of the main area which I could fill with the smaller things that I could fill in here, and leave the outer area where there's just a little bit more space open to be able to place as many of the small and flat rides that I can actually fit in this very low ceiling in there. And one idea I actually had over here, which this was recorded, I think, yeah, this was recorded before episode 5, 6 and 7 of Bone Shaker, was to make the picnic tables into one building. The picnic tables idea was Devilfish idea on Reddit or YouTube, so massive credit goes out to him. But it works a little bit better if you save it under one building, just by lowering one building piece into the ground like a wall or a roof piece, and then use the 3D gizmo by pressing X to put the scenery pieces together. And you can just save one picnic table as a building and basically copy that over and use it throughout the park, which is pretty nice. And that's basically what I wanted to do around here with the benches and the planters and anything else that I could just easily copy around as well. It's kind of funny because the scenery item is actually a driftwood plank, or the two driftwood planks, but most of the uses I've seen for it are actually not driftwood. Hell, it's kind of strange that we have driftwood anyway, since we don't actually have water yet. I guess it could be used on beaches, but not with any water, that is. But they're actually incredibly useful. One of the best pieces, I think, in the game, actually, since they have this really good texture, definitely a sort of really plank look to them, and you can build just about anything you really want out of them, especially these smaller path items like window boxes, flower boxes, planters, benches, picnic tables, and they work pretty well for wooden framework and even roofs as well. Definitely one of my favorite pieces at the moment. Anyway, that's a bit off topic. I wanted to finish the roller coaster just pretty quickly. It is a zero coaster, but it's more or less inspired by the Vekoma Junior coasters. I am still not sure why I like Vekoma. It might just be the fact that I'm Dutch, but it's a pretty big inspiration in this case. Now, all of the rides in this park are going to be very family oriented, except for the zipper, which I just placed, I guess, which is the one exception. One of the reasons, of course, why I barely placed any thrill rides is the fact that the ceiling is pretty low and doesn't actually allow for many of the thrill rides that we have in the game at the moment. But I guess another reason would just be that, you know, this is a very small park. It's kind of inspired by Toverland, and I wanted to keep that sort of family sort of approach to the park, especially since it's so small. Same goes for Toverland when it just opened. It also opened with just one hall, with one roller coaster and some family rides. It's not too unrealistic actually, and this building somehow fits the, well, the theme park having inside of it, so maybe if it's done being a convention center it could be turned into it. But yeah, that's why I realistically felt I wanted to go with this sort of, well, these flat rides which are pretty family oriented, and having a family coaster, or kiddie coaster you might even say, as a centerpiece of the park itself. And what I also did want to do there, which I'll probably get to, yeah, I'll get to later in this video, is actually cover up the walls, which is something that I did struggle with quite a bit all the time, because there is no way to really get fancy walls. I couldn't get any glass in to let light in, because that's just not how the convention center is built. And pretty much the issue here is that if it's night, it's a bit too dark, but if it's day, there's an awkward lighting thing going on where pretty much the entire park is cast in a shadow, but it still lets some of the sunlight in, which is a bit awkward, but nothing I could really avoid. But that made it kind of awkward to make the insides actually somewhat realistic and resembling a real-life theme park. Coming back to the planters actually that I just placed a little bit ago, that I completely skipped over. I wanted to get quite a good amount of planters with trees in here, basically because I want to avoid getting trees anywhere except for the planters in general, basically because it is an indoor theme park. and I don't want to start having forests or anything like that in the theme park. I do have quite a few patches of grass here and there, which is already pushing it quite a bit, but I felt that would just make it a little bit nicer to look at than just having concrete everywhere, which is something that I wish I could have actually done, but it's pretty much impossible. The roof tiles have the things sticking out on the side, so you can't really use those to get any kind of texture in. So the thing that I ended up using for the crown textures to make it look a little bit more like it's actually an indoor theme park and not an indoor forest is to use this sand as a sort of concrete texture, but it's not quite that convincing. But yeah, I wanted to mostly use planters and many window boxes or I mean I should say flower boxes to get some foliage in here while not making it too unrealistic for an indoor theme park, while at the same time giving it a bit of atmosphere as well. And over here is pretty much one pretty big space which I figured I could make a little path into here, because it seemed like too small of a space to really get another flat ride in. But then again, it's too large of a space to do nothing with, especially in an indoor theme park where in this very small hall I did want to make the most out of this hall and use pretty much every inch of the building that I had without making it look too cramped, and felt this was a pretty good way to get that in there. Have a small path lead there with just a few benches in the future and make it a nice little back area in that kind of way. And since I have a food stall and I have toilets, I don't have any head shops, but I did miss one thing which is pretty important, which is a drink stall. I figured it would be nice to have a little cosmic cow over here, so that's what I decided to go with. It's also a pretty simple building, a little alpine inspired building. I wanted to dress it up like a stall, much like a Roller Coaster Tycoon stall, because even though I'm not a huge fan of that, this is sort of an indoor theme park, so trying to create the classic theme park idea while it's already a building within a building. So just figured if I would have a standalone building within this building, a nice little stall for drinks could work quite well over there, and just make sure that the area around it is good enough to just take a seat somewhere and sit about and have your cosmic cow milkshake, that kind of idea generally. Which is also where I decided I would make this simple bench and place that along the park, and just make sure that there are some areas where people can sit. Especially since this is a theme park, I'm placing many benches over here, just so people can sit just about everywhere. The only thing that is missing still is a litter bin, which is still something I might want to get back into the future. It is pretty possible to make a litter bin out of the driftwood planks and just copy that around. It's not that convincing, but it's better than nothing. So definitely something I want to mess around with in the future as well. There are so many things you can actually do with the current scenery pieces to make your own kind of path elements, even though there aren't any more path elements in the game as of yet. So there's definitely a lot to still mess with that, and hopefully at least this gives you some ideas. And just because these trees are really handy, the thing I like about cypresses is that they're really similar to poplars, and I'm pretty much using them as poplars in this case, which are a really often used tree because they grow really quickly. They're pretty narrow, and they're just pretty good because you can place trees and make things look a little bit more inviting and a little bit more atmospheric, but they're still quite small and narrow, so they don't block the view completely. So you can have some trees and plants in there without making the park look like a forest, which is basically exactly what I wanted in this case. Now, because I didn't really like staring at an ugly white border there, I figured it would be nice to at least have a little scenery-like border alongside the edge of the park, and add a bit of rocks here and there to, well, here and there, pretty much everywhere, to make a sort of rocky mountain-like little area alongside the side here, and dress it up a little bit as well so it doesn't look like it's a beach anymore, which it kinda does at the moment, and actually add some stuff alongside the rocks as well, just to make things a bit more inviting. I do have to say, and I just don't wanna, you know, not be critical of myself or the entire E3 thing in general. This was incredibly rushed in the end, and you might have probably been able to tell. I know for a fact that some people have been able to tell. It was definitely quite rushed, hence why this is only the South exhibit hall, and I didn't have the West exhibit hall in it, which I kind of hoped would be possible in the end, but didn't really have time to do so. And yeah, so there were definitely many compromises that were made just for time constraints, like going with the quite simple theme and things like that. And in a perfect world, I would have kind of hoped to see some buildings alongside the side of the walls. Like what you commonly see in North theme parks is that you don't really have actual buildings, but just like decorative buildings alongside the walls, or painted buildings, or hell, sometimes even constructed buildings that really protrude from the wall on the side of the park to kind of make that border not so much something that just encloses the park, but something that's really incorporated into the scenery. And that's something which I kind of missed in this case, and definitely something which you might want to try if you're making an indoor theme park, and something which I would have definitely improved on as well if I would look back at this park and have more time to work on it again. Now the rest of this is just filling up the park with more rockwork to make sure that there aren't any really empty spaces, especially since it is an indoor theme park. I didn't want to be left with any spaces that were left unused, because you realistically don't really see it. You don't have that much space left in an indoor theme park with the pretty small halls that they're built in. So not making use of a certain space is quite a waste, and if you still have some empty space, just place a little scenery item in there and just incorporate it a bit into the scenery and the theming of the entire hall. So that's what I pretty much figured I would do with this little corner over here, to the left of which it is pretty much just the entrance, which is a little bit off theming. I didn't really figure of any other way to make it like work without not incorporating it into the theme of the park, so I ended up just going with a pretty generic entrance for the ticket booths there, but I'm still pretty happy with how that came out. And the rest of it is also pretty much just putting barrels everywhere, because you can always just spam barrels if you have no idea what else to really do in the end. And I also just wanted to do some quick fixing up of the coaster smooths there, which always works really well. I do recommend not doing it too much, because it might change your layout, especially if you have some really tight curves, but in general you can make layouts pretty smooth if you just go over them a couple of times with the smooth tool. Really depends on how not smooth or smooth a section is when it comes to how much you have to smooth it out, but it always works pretty well. Anyway, this is a final overview of what the park looks like in its finished state from above, which is a shot that I can offer, which the Planet Coaster video does not actually offer. And yeah, this is basically what it looks like and how it's laid out. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys at least learned some stuff from this, and if you guys still have some feedback or suggestions, that's always cool as well. Anyway, thanks for watching, and bye.